in the cold depths of space, where alien empires stretch across galaxies, and humans are nothing more than servants and slaves. One moment of unexpected kindness can shatter the foundations of everything. When a most feared warrior in the Draconian Empire breaks down in tears, believing no one can see her pain, a simple human mechanic makes a choice that will echo across the stars. What happens when a galaxy's most powerful predator discovers that the species they've always seen as weak prey might actually possess the one thing their advanced civilization lost long ago: genuine compassion? This is the story of how a single act of human decency became the spark that would either save two species or destroy them both. Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't in your claws or your weapons. It's in your ability to see the person behind the monster. The hangar bay of the Draconian warship Crimson Talon stretched out like a metallic cathedral, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that even the harsh industrial lights couldn't penetrate. The air tasted of recycled oxygen, metal polish, and something else, something that Marcus Chun had learned to recognize after 3 years of servitude: fear. It hung in the atmosphere like invisible smoke, seeping from every human worker who scurried between the massive war machines that filled the space. Marcus wiped grease from his hands with a worn cloth, his calloused fingers moving automatically while his mind wandered to places that weren't trapped behind force fields and slave collars. The collar around his neck felt heavier today, its neural interfaces pressing against his skin like cold metal fingers. Every human aboard wore one. It monitored everything: heart rate, stress levels, thoughts if they wandered too far toward rebellion. The Draconians had perfected the art of slavery over thousands of years, and humans were just the latest species to discover how efficient their methods could be. The massive fighter craft in front of him represented everything he hated about his captors. The Draconian Interceptor stood 12 meters tall, its obsidian hull gleaming like a predator's scales. Weapon ports lined its wings like rows of teeth, each one capable of reducing a human settlement to ash in seconds. The ship's design spoke of a species that had evolved from apex predators. Everything about it screamed danger, from its blade-like silhouette to the way it seemed to crouch even when stationary, as if ready to pounce. Marcus had been working on these ships for long enough to know their every bolt and wire, every weakness and strength. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Draconians trusted their human slaves to maintain the very weapons that kept them enslaved. They saw humans as too broken, too defeated to ever use that knowledge against them. Maybe they were right. The thought made his stomach turn. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hangar, the distinctive click of draconian claws against metal decking. Marcus kept his head down, focusing on the plasma conduit he was supposed to be calibrating. The first rule of survival was simple: never make eye contact unless commanded to do so. Draconians interpreted direct eye contact as a challenge, and challenges from slaves were met with swift, brutal punishment. The footsteps stopped somewhere behind him, followed by the rustle of fabric and a sound he didn't immediately recognize. It took his brain several seconds to process what he was hearing, because it was so utterly impossible that his mind rejected it at first. Someone was crying. Not just crying, sobbing. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and broken. The sound echoed off the hangar walls, creating a symphony of anguish that made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. But the impossible part wasn't the crying itself. It was that the voice behind those sobs was unmistakably draconian. Marcus had never heard a draconian cry before. In 3 years of captivity, he had seen them rage, seen them display cold satisfaction, even witnessed what might have been amusement in their reptilian features. But emotion, real, vulnerable emotion, was something he had convinced himself they were incapable of feeling. His hands stilled on the plasma conduit. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore what he was hearing, to keep working and pretend he noticed nothing. Getting involved in draconian affairs was a guaranteed way to end up as an example for other slaves. The smart thing to do was keep his head down and let whatever was happening play out without him. But the sobbing continued, and with each broken sound, Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he had thought was dead. It was the same feeling that had gotten him in trouble as a child, the same impulse that had driven him to stand up for others, even when it meant taking a beating himself. His mother had called it his stupid hero complex. His father had been blunter. Marcus, your mouth is going to get you killed someday. They had both been right, in a way. His refusal to keep quiet when his colony's governor had started selling food supplies to alien traders while children starved had marked him for transportation when the Draconians arrived. Speaking truth to power had cost him everything: his home, his family, his freedom. And now that same destructive impulse was stirring again, threatening to get him killed on an alien warship billions of miles from Earth. The crying intensified, becoming almost desperate. Whoever, it was clearly believed they were alone, that their moment of vulnerability was private. Marcus found himself turning around before his rational mind could stop him. The sight that greeted him challenged everything he thought he knew about the species that had enslaved humanity. She was magnificent and terrible at the same time, even crouched in grief. She stood nearly 3 meters tall, her scaled hide shifting between deep emerald and black in the harsh hangar lighting. Her wings were folded tight against her back, but Marcus could see enough to know they would span at least 5 meters when extended. Every line of her body spoke of lethal efficiency, from the way her muscles coiled beneath her scales to the talons that could probably tear through metal. But it was her face that stopped Marcus cold. Draconian features were alien enough that humans had trouble reading their expressions, but grief was universal. Her elongated snout was pressed against her clawed hands, and her entire body shook with the force of her sobs. Tears, actual tears, leaked from her golden eyes and splashed onto the deck plating. She wore the crimson and gold uniform of a Talon commander, the highest military rank below the ship's captain. Marcus recognized the insignia from the briefings all slaves received about the ship's hierarchy. This wasn't just any Draconian. This was one of their elite warriors, someone who commanded entire battle groups and decided the fate of star systems. And she was crying alone in a hangar bay like a lost child. Marcus knew he should turn around. Every survival instinct he had developed over 3 years of slavery screamed at him to walk away. This was none of his business. Getting involved would only bring pain, possibly death. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to pretend he had seen nothing. Instead, he found himself taking a step closer. The movement caused a loose piece of deck plating to shift under his weight with a soft metallic scrape. The Draconian's head snapped up immediately, her golden eyes locking onto his brown ones. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus saw her grief transform into shock, then rapidly shift towards something that looked like rage. Her hand moved to the plasma pistol at her hip with liquid grace, the weapon clearing its holster before Marcus could even register the motion. The business end of the weapon pointed directly at his chest, its charge indicator glowing angry red in the dim light. "Slave," she hissed, her voice carrying the distinctive sibilant quality that all Draconians possessed. But there was something else in her tone, embarrassment, perhaps even shame. "How long have you been watching?" Marcus raised his hands slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I just turned around," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the weapon aimed at his heart. I heard someone in pain." The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge. Admitting that he had recognized her distress was dangerous. It implied that he saw her as something other than the perfect predator the Draconian military wanted their enemies to fear. Her grip on the pistol tightened, and Marcus saw her finger move to the trigger. He was going to die for a moment of misplaced compassion, and the irony of it made him almost want to laugh. Almost. But then something changed in her expression. The rage faded, replaced by confusion and what might have been curiosity. "Pain?" she repeated, the word coming out like she was testing its taste. "You believe I feel pain?" "I don't know what I believe," Marcus admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. I just know that crying usually means someone is hurting, no matter what species they are. The Draconian stared at him for a long moment, her weapon never wavering. Marcus could see her mind working behind those alien eyes, processing implications and possibilities he couldn't begin to guess at. "You should not have seen this," she said finally, but there was less threat in her voice than before. "No," Marcus agreed. "I probably shouldn't have, but I did." Another long silence stretched between them. The hangar bay seemed to hold its breath, the usual mechanical sounds fading into background static. Even the other human workers had vanished, either called to other duties or smart enough to make themselves scarce when weapons were drawn. "What is your designation, slave?" the Draconian asked. "Marcus Chun, maintenance technician, class 7. The words came automatically, drilled into him during his first weeks aboard the ship. Chun. She pronounced his name carefully, as if testing each syllable. "You maintain our fighters." "Yes, Commander." The rank was a guess, but the insignia on her uniform made it a safe one. "Do you hate us, Marcus Chun?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, as if she truly didn't know the answer. Marcus considered lying, giving her the response that would keep him alive. Instead, he found himself speaking the truth again. "I hate what you've done to my people. I hate being a slave. But hate is exhausting, and I'm too tired to carry that much anger anymore." The Draconian's head tilted slightly, a gesture that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of a bird studying an interesting insect. "You do not hate me personally?" "I don't know you personally," Marcus replied. "All I know is that you're crying alone in a hangar bay, and that tells me you're capable of feeling hurt. It's hard to hate someone who can hurt." The weapon in her hand wavered slightly, the barrel dropping a few degrees. "My people would consider such sentiment a weakness. Maybe. My people would consider it a strength. Your people are slaves." "Yes," Marcus said simply. "We are." The admission seemed to take the wind out of her sails. The plasma pistol lowered further, though she didn't holster it entirely. "You should return to your duties, Marcus Chun. Forget what you have seen here." Marcus nodded, understanding the dismissal for what it was. But as he turned to go, something made him pause. Maybe it was the way her shoulders slumped when she thought he wasn't looking, or the sound of her breathing, still shaky from her earlier tears. Whatever it was, it made him turn back. "Commander?" She looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "Whatever's hurting you," Marcus said quietly, "I hope it gets better." Before she could respond, he walked away, forcing himself not to look back. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of the plasma pistol being holstered, followed by a whisper so quiet he almost missed it. "Thank you." The words followed him across the hangar bay and stayed with him for the rest of his shift. As he worked, Marcus tried to process what had just happened. In 3 years of slavery, he had never had a conversation with a Draconian that didn't involve orders, punishments, or threats. The idea that one of them might actually be capable of gratitude was so foreign that his mind struggled to accept it. But the memory of her tears was real, as was the broken sound of her sobbing. Whatever the Draconians were, they weren't the emotionless killing machines he had assumed them to be. At least, not all of them. The realization should have been comforting. Instead, it left Marcus feeling more confused and conflicted than ever. It was easier to hate your captors when you could convince yourself they were monsters. When they started showing human emotions, the simple equations of good and evil became much more complicated. As his shift ended and he made his way back to the slave quarters, Marcus found himself wondering about the Draconian commander. What had broken her composure so completely? What kind of pain could drive a warrior of her apparent status to tears? More importantly, why did he care? The questions followed him into the cramped sleeping alcove he shared with 3 other human slaves, but sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw golden eyes bright with tears and heard the echo of a simple thank you that might have changed everything. In the morning, he told himself he would forget about the encounter. He would return to his duties, keep his head down, and focus on survival. Getting emotionally involved with his captors was a luxury he couldn't afford. But, as Marcus finally, drifted off to sleep, he found himself hoping that the commander, whatever her real name was, had found some measure of peace in the hours since their encounter. It was a dangerous hope, and he knew it. But some part of him, the same part that had gotten him enslaved in the first place, refused to let it go. 3 days passed before Marcus saw her again. The intervening time had been filled with routine maintenance work and the constant background anxiety that plagued all human slaves aboard the Crimson Talon. Marcus had almost convinced himself that his encounter with the Draconian commander had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The alternative, that he had witnessed genuine vulnerability from one of his captors, was too dangerous to contemplate for long. But when she appeared in his section of the hangar bay during the night shift, when most of the other workers had been reassigned to different duties, Marcus knew that their previous meeting had been very real indeed. She moved with the fluid grace that all Draconians possessed, but there was something different about her posture now. Where before she had carried herself with the rigid confidence of military authority, now she seemed almost hesitant. She approached his workstation slowly, as if giving him time to object to her presence. Marcus was elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a damaged scout ship, trying to replace a burned-out plasma relay that had been giving him trouble for hours. The delicate work required most of his attention, but he was acutely aware of the massive alien presence that had materialized beside him. "Marcus Chun," she said, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to the other workers scattered throughout the hangar. "Commander," Marcus replied without looking up from his work. The plasma relay was fighting him, its connectors refusing to align properly with their housing. One wrong move could trigger a feedback surge that would fry half the ship's electrical systems. "You may address me as Zaraketh," she said, and Marcus nearly dropped his tools in surprise. Draconians never shared their personal names with slaves. Ever. Slaves used ranks and titles, keeping interactions formal and distant. The fact that she had volunteered her actual name was so unprecedented that Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. That's your name?" he managed, still focused on the stubborn relay. "It is what my clutch siblings called me, before I earned my military designation." There was something wistful in her tone, a note of longing that made Marcus pause in his work. "What's your military designation?" The question slipped out before Marcus could stop himself. Asking personal questions of Draconians was another unwritten rule he was apparently determined to break. "Talon Commander Zaraketh Mordun, First Wing of the Crimson Talon, veteran of 12 campaigns, bearer of the Crystal Scar." The titles rolled off her tongue with practiced precision, but there was no pride in her voice. If anything, she sounded tired. Marcus finally managed to coax the plasma relay into position and secured it with a soft click. Only then did he turn to face her, wiping his hands on his work coveralls. "That's quite a list of accomplishments." "Accomplishments?" She repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. "Yes, I suppose destroying colonies and enslaving populations does qualify as an accomplishment in the eyes of my people." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. In 3 years of captivity, he had never heard a Draconian express anything resembling regret about their empire's actions. They spoke of conquest with the same casual indifference that Marcus might use to discuss the weather. "You sound like you don't agree with it," Marcus said carefully. Zaraketh's golden eyes fixed on his face, studying his expression with an intensity that made him want to look away. "What would you do, Marcus Chun, if you discovered that everything you had been raised to believe was a lie?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Marcus didn't dare explore. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose it would depend on what the truth turned out to be." "The truth," Zaraketh said slowly, "is that we are monsters." Marcus felt his breath catch. This conversation was moving into territory that could get them both killed. But something in her voice, a rawness, a desperate need to be understood, made him stay silent and listen. For centuries, we have told ourselves that conquest is natural, that strength gives us the right to dominate the weak, that other species exist only to serve our empire. Her claws scraped against the metal workbench as her hands clenched into fists. We called it the natural order. We called it destiny. What changed your mind? Marcus asked quietly. Zaraketh was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she had decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I watch your people fight for each other on Kepler, 442b. The name hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. Kepler, 442b, had been one of the last human colonies to fall, and its destruction had been broadcast across the Empire as an example of draconian might. Marcus had been forced to watch the transmission along with every other slave aboard the ship. I was there, Zaraketh continued, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the hangar walls. I led the assault on your primary settlement. Your people had no weapons that could threaten our ships, no defenses that could stop our advance. By every tactical measure, they should have surrendered immediately. Marcus remembered the reports from the few survivors who had made it to other colonies before the communication blackout. The defenders of Kepler, 442b, had held out for 6 days against impossible odds, buying time for civilian evacuations that ultimately saved thousands of lives. Instead, they fought, Zaraketh said, wonder creeping into her voice. Not because they believed they could win, but because they believed their sacrifice might save others. I watched humans throw themselves against our battle lines with nothing but infantry weapons and improvised explosives. I watched them die to protect people they had never met. She turned to look directly at Marcus, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. On the final day, I personally led the assault on your command bunker. Inside, I found 12 humans, soldiers, and civilians alike, who had barricaded themselves around the communication array. They knew they were going to die. They could have surrendered, could have begged for mercy. Instead, they spent their last moments transmitting warnings to other colonies, telling them where we were and what to expect. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never heard this part of the story before. One of them was a child, Zaraketh whispered. No more than 10 years. She was operating the communication equipment while the adults fought to hold the perimeter. When I killed the last offender, she looked up at me with these enormous brown eyes the color of earth and growing things, and said thank you for making it quick. The tears were flowing freely down Marcus's cheeks now, but he didn't try to wipe them away. She thanked me, Zaraketh repeated, her voice breaking. This child, who had watched everyone she loved die, who knew she was about to join them, thanked me for the mercy of a quick death. And in that moment, I realized that I was not a warrior defending my people. I was not bringing order to the galaxy. I was just a monster killing innocents. Marcus reached out without thinking, his hand coming to rest on one of her massive clawed appendages. The contact should have been impossible. Humans didn't touch Draconians without permission, and Draconians certainly didn't allow themselves to be comforted by slaves. But in that moment, neither of them seemed to care about the rules. That's when you started crying, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I have not stopped crying since, Zaraketh admitted. Not truly. I perform my duties, I command my forces, I carry out my orders. But inside, I am always weeping for that child and the thousands like her that I have killed in service to an empire built on suffering. They stood in silence for several minutes, human and draconian, connected by grief and an understanding that transcended species boundaries. Around them, the hangar bay continued its mechanical symphony, but the sound felt distant and unimportant. Why are you telling me this? Marcus finally asked. Because I need someone to know, Zaraketh replied. I need someone to understand that not all of us are blind to what we have become. And because you showed me kindness when I was at my lowest point. In my culture, such debts must be acknowledged. You don't owe me anything, Marcus said firmly. What I did wasn't about debt or obligation. I just couldn't walk away from someone who was hurting. That, Zaraketh said with something that might have been a smile, is exactly what makes your species so dangerous to mine. Dangerous? Marcus couldn't hide his confusion. Humans were slaves, utterly powerless against their draconian masters. How could they possibly be dangerous? Your compassion is a weapon we have no defense against, Zaraketh explained. We built our empire on the assumption that all intelligent species are fundamentally selfish, that given enough pressure, anyone will sacrifice others to save themselves. But humans prove that assumption wrong. She gestured around the hangar bay, where other human workers continued their tasks with quiet efficiency. You work on our ships, knowing that these very vessels will be used to enslave more of your people. You could sabotage them easily. Your technical knowledge gives you 100 opportunities for rebellion. Yet you don't. Do you know why? Marcus thought about it for a moment. Because if we sabotage the ships, the Draconians will execute 10 humans for every act of sabotage. We've seen it happen. Exactly, Zaraketh said. You choose to remain enslaved rather than cause suffering to your fellow humans. You sacrifice your own freedom to protect strangers. It is a form of courage that my people cannot comprehend, because we have never possessed it ourselves. The implications of her words began to sink in. You're saying that our unwillingness to fight back is what makes us dangerous. I'm saying that your willingness to put others before yourself challenges everything my people believe about the nature of intelligence itself. Zaraketh's voice grew more intense. We have conquered dozens of species across the galaxy. All of them eventually learned to accept their subjugation because the cost of resistance became too high. But humans found a different way to resist. We didn't resist, Marcus protested. We lost. We're slaves. You resist every day, Zaraketh countered. Not through violence or sabotage, but through simple acts of decency. You help each other. You share your rations with those who are sick. You comfort those who are grieving. You maintain hope even when there is no logical reason to do so. And slowly, inevitably, you force us to see you as people rather than property. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand what she was saying. Some of my people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions, Zaraketh continued. Questions about whether intelligence necessarily implies selfishness. Questions about what we might learn from a species that chooses sacrifice over survival. And those questions are dangerous to an empire built on the assumption of our inherent superiority. What happens when those questions reach the wrong ears? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then, your species will be declared too dangerous to exist, Zaraketh said grimly. The High Command will order your complete extermination rather than risk ideological contamination of the Empire. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The idea that human compassion, the very quality that made them human, could be seen as a threat worthy of genocide was almost too horrible to comprehend. How long do we have? He managed to ask. I don't know, Zaraketh admitted. Months, perhaps years. The High Command moves slowly when it comes to species-wide decisions. But the debates have already begun. There are those who argue that humans are too useful as workers to destroy, but there are others who see your psychological influence on Draconian soldiers as an unacceptable risk. Marcus slumped against the workbench, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had just learned. Humanity's survival hung in the balance. And the threat came not from their weakness, but from their strength, their capacity for empathy and self-sacrifice that apparently had no precedent in Draconian experience. Is there anything we can do? He asked. Zaraketh was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the hangar's harsh lighting. Perhaps, she said finally, but it would require trust between our species that has never existed before. It would require humans and Draconians working together in ways that both sides would consider treasonous. What do you mean? I mean, Zaraketh said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels, that there are others among my people who have begun to question the Empire's methods. Not many, but some. And if we could find a way to demonstrate that cooperation with humans makes us stronger rather than weaker. She trailed off, leaving the implications unspoken. But Marcus understood. She was talking about the possibility of some kind of alliance, a partnership between humans and reform-minded Draconians that could potentially save both species from the consequences of their current relationship. It was a dangerous idea, a desperate idea, and probably an impossible idea. But It was also the first real hope Marcus had felt since the day his colony had been destroyed. "What would you need from us?" Marcus asked. "Trust," Zaraketh said simply, "and patience, and a willingness to believe that monsters can sometimes learn to become something better." Marcus looked into her golden eyes and saw not the alien predator that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years, but a person struggling with guilt and seeking redemption. It should have been impossible. Everything he knew about Draconians told him that this conversation was an elaborate trap, that trusting her would only lead to betrayal and death. But the tears he had witnessed 3 days ago had been real. The grief in her voice when she spoke of the child on Kepler 442b was genuine, and the desperate hope in her eyes as she waited for his answer was something no Draconian should have been capable of faking. "You'll have it," Marcus said quietly. "All of it." Zaraketh's massive form seemed to sag with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus replied. "We still have to figure out how to save two species who have been trying to destroy each other for 3 years. "Perhaps," Zaraketh said with the faintest hint of a smile, "that's exactly the kind of impossible task that humans specialize in." As she turned to leave, Marcus called out to her one last time. "Zaraketh." She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "That child on Kepler 442b, Marcus said. "What was her name?" "I never learned it," Zaraketh admitted, and Marcus heard the regret in her voice. "But she had a small toy with her, a stuffed animal of some kind. A bear, I think you call them. It was brown and worn, like it had been loved for a very long time." Marcus nodded, filing the detail away. Somewhere in the galaxy, there were people who had known that child, who had loved her and mourned her death. If they somehow managed to survive what was coming, Marcus promised himself that he would find them and tell them how brave she had been in her final moments. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless in the context of species-wide survival. But as Zaraketh disappeared into the shadows between the docked ships, Marcus realized that small acts of remembrance and honor might be exactly what separated humanity from the monsters that sought to destroy them. And maybe, just maybe, they would be enough to save them all. The meeting place Zaraketh had chosen was as far from the main corridors as possible. A forgotten maintenance shaft deep in the bowels of the Crimson Talon where the ship's vital systems hummed with mechanical precision. The air was thick with the ozone scent of electrical equipment and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. It was also completely unmonitored, one of the few spaces aboard the ship where conversations could take place without fear of surveillance. Marcus arrived first, his heart hammering against his ribs as he crawled through the narrow access tunnel. 3 weeks had passed since his initial conversation with Zaraketh, 3 weeks of careful signals and coded messages passed through work assignments and duty rosters. The Draconian commander had been as good as her word, slowly introducing Marcus to others who shared her growing doubts about the Empire's methods. The first had been Thekmor, a junior engineer whose clutch brother had been killed in a slave uprising on the mining world of Zirian Prime. The official reports claimed he had died heroically putting down a rebellion, but Thekmor had learned the truth. His brother had been executed for refusing to kill human children who had gotten caught in the crossfire. The revelation had shattered Thekmor's faith in the military hierarchy and left him questioning everything he had been taught about duty and honor. The second was Velterra, a medical officer who had been treating human slaves in the ship's infirmary. Initially, she had approached her work with clinical detachment, viewing humans as sophisticated animals requiring basic maintenance. But months of interaction had forced her to confront the uncomfortable reality that her patients displayed intelligence, creativity, and emotional complexity that rivaled her own species. The cognitive dissonance had gradually eroded her ability to see humans as property. Now, as Marcus settled into the cramped maintenance space, he wondered who else Zaraketh might have recruited to their impossible cause. The tunnel was barely wide enough for him to sit upright, but it would be a tight squeeze for anyone of draconian proportions. The fact that they were meeting here at all spoke to the desperation of their situation. The sound of approaching movement echoed through the shaft, accompanied by the distinctive scraping of claws against metal. Marcus pressed himself against one wall as Zaraketh maneuvered her bulk through the narrow space, her movements awkward but determined. Behind her came Thekmor, his smaller frame allowing him to navigate the tunnel with relative ease. Velterra brought up the rear, her medical kit slung across her back in case they needed to tend to injuries from their clandestine crawling. "This is undignified," Velterra muttered as she squeezed into the maintenance chamber, her scales scraping against the low ceiling. "Dignity is a luxury we can no longer afford," Zaraketh replied, settling into a position that brought her eye level closer to Marcus's. "The High Command has accelerated their timeline." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How accelerated?" 6 months, Thekmor said grimly. "Perhaps less. I accessed the engineering schedules this morning. They're retrofitting the entire Fourth Fleet with atmosphere processors designed for complete planetary sterilization." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Atmospheric processors were typically used for terraforming uninhabitable worlds, but the same technology could be reversed to strip away breathable atmosphere and leave planets barren. It was a weapon of absolute genocide, designed to erase entire species without leaving behind anything useful for conquest. "They're not planning to enslave humanity anymore," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're planning to wipe us out completely. The debates have concluded," Zaraketh confirmed. "Enough members of the High Command have been convinced that human psychological influence poses an unacceptable threat to Imperial stability. The order for species termination will be issued within the month." Velterra's claws scraped against the metal flooring. "My own medical reports contributed to this decision," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "I documented human emotional responses, their capacity for abstract reasoning, their social bonding patterns. I thought I was providing scientific data. Instead, I gave them evidence to support their fears. We all played our part in this outcome," Zaraketh said firmly. "The question now is whether we can do anything to prevent it." Marcus leaned forward, studying the alien faces around him. Each of these Draconians had reached the same conclusion he had, that their species were heading toward a confrontation that would end in the extinction of one or both races. But, unlike Marcus, they had the power to potentially change the outcome. "What are our options?" he asked. "Limited," Thekmor admitted. "A direct challenge to the High Command would be considered treason. Even if we could convince enough Draconians to support us, civil war would only accelerate humanity's destruction. The hardliners would use the conflict as justification for immediate action." "What about sabotage?" Marcus suggested. "If the atmosphere processors could be damaged or disabled." "The Fourth Fleet is dispersed across 17 different shipyards," Velterra said, shaking her head. "We would need a coordinated operation involving dozens of conspirators. The security risk would be enormous. And, even if we succeeded," Zaraketh added, "they would simply build new processors. We would buy time, nothing more." Marcus felt frustration building in his chest. Every path they explored seemed to lead to the same dead end. Humanity was doomed, and even their newfound Draconian allies couldn't see a way to save them. "There has to be something," Marcus said desperately. "Some weakness we can exploit, some advantage we haven't considered." "There is one possibility," Zaraketh said slowly. "But it would require a sacrifice that no human should be asked to make." The way she said it made Marcus's skin crawl. "What kind of sacrifice?" "The High Command's decision is based on fear," Zaraketh explained. "Fear that human influence will spread throughout the Empire, undermining the ideological foundations of our society. They see extermination as the only way to contain this threat." "Right," Marcus said. So what if we could prove them right?" The suggestion hit the maintenance chamber like a bombshell. Thekmor's eyes widened with shock, while Velterra made a sound that might have been either horror or admiration. "Explain," Marcus said carefully. Zaraketh took a deep breath before continuing. "What if we could demonstrate that human psychological influence isn't limited to a few isolated cases? What if we could show that it's already spread far enough to threaten the stability of the entire Imperial military?" Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he began to understand what she was proposing. "You want to start a rebellion?" he said. "Not a rebellion," Zaraketh corrected. "A demonstration. If enough draconian military units refused to participate in the genocide, the High Command would be forced to confront the reality that their own forces have been contaminated by human influence." "And then what?" Marcus demanded. "They execute every draconian who shows sympathy for humans and proceed with the extermination using loyal forces?" "Perhaps," Zaraketh admitted. "Or perhaps they would realize that the contamination has spread too far to be contained through simple elimination. Perhaps they would be forced to consider alternatives." Thekmore leaned forward, his voice intense with possibility. "She's right, Marcus. If half the Imperial military refused orders, the High Command would face a choice: destroy their own military capacity or find another solution to the human problem." "What other solution?" Marcus asked. "Coexistence," Velterra said simply. "If human influence can't be eliminated, then it must be managed. The Empire would be forced to develop new policies based on partnership rather than domination." Marcus stared at the three draconians, trying to process the magnitude of what they were suggesting. They were talking about orchestrating the largest military mutiny in galactic history, using human slaves as a psychological weapon against their own people. How many draconians would need to refuse orders for this to work? Marcus asked. "Conservative estimates suggest we would need at least 30% of the Imperial military," Zaraketh said. "Enough to cripple offensive operations, but not enough to trigger a full civil war." "And how many draconians have been influenced by human contact?" "Unknown," Thekmore admitted. "But there are indicators. Efficiency ratings in units with significant human slave populations have begun to decline. Not because of sabotage, but because draconian personnel are spending time on activities that don't directly contribute to military objectives." "What kind of activities?" Marcus asked. "Conversations," Velterra said. "Social interaction beyond the minimum necessary for work assignments. Some units have reported draconians asking human slaves about their personal histories, their families, their hopes for the future. Behaviors that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago." Marcus felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "You think we're already changing you just by being ourselves? We think human psychological influence operates on a much deeper level than the High Command realizes," Zaraketh confirmed. "Your capacity for empathy appears to be infectious under prolonged contact. But the effects have been gradual enough that most draconians haven't recognized them as significant. Until now," Thekmore added. "The proposed genocide will force every draconian who has experienced human influence to make choice. Participate in the systematic murder of beings they have come to see as people, or refuse and face the consequences." Marcus leaned back against the maintenance chamber wall, overwhelmed by the implications of their plan. It was simultaneously brilliant and insane, offering the possibility of saving humanity while potentially destroying both species in the process. "What would you need from the human population?" he asked finally. "Coordination," Zaraketh said immediately. "When the moment comes, human slaves across the Empire need to be ready to act as psychological anchors for sympathetic draconians. Not through rebellion or violence, but through simple human connection." "Psychological anchors?" Marcus repeated. "When a draconian receives orders to participate in genocide, there needs to be a human nearby to remind them why such orders should be refused," Velterra explained. "Personal relationships that make the abstract concept of species extermination into a concrete choice about individual lives." "You want us to make ourselves targets," Marcus realized. "We want you to make yourselves irreplaceable," Zaraketh corrected. "If enough draconians are forced to choose between following orders and protecting humans they have come to care about, the emotional weight of those decisions will paralyze the Imperial military." Marcus thought about the plan for a long moment, considering all the ways it could go wrong. If they miscalculated the spread of human influence among draconian forces, they would only succeed in identifying sympathizers for execution. If the High Command decided to proceed with genocide despite military resistance, humanity would die anyway. If the resulting conflict escalated into full civil war, both species might be destroyed. But if they did nothing, humanity would certainly be extinct within 6 months. How do we coordinate something like this across the entire empire? Marcus asked. Carefully, Zaraketh said. Human slaves are already connected through informal networks that exist beneath official notice. We need to use those networks to spread a message. When the orders come, be ready to remind your Draconian contacts why those orders should be refused. What about communication security? If the High Command discovers what we're planning, then we all die, Thekmor said bluntly. But we die trying to save both our species rather than watching helplessly as they destroy each other. Marcus nodded slowly. The plan was desperate and dangerous, with success depending on variables they couldn't control and consequences they couldn't predict. But it was also the first real chance humanity had been offered since the beginning of their enslavement. I'll need time to reach out to the human networks, Marcus said, and we'll need to identify which Draconians are most likely to be sympathetic to our cause. Already in progress, Valterra confirmed. I've been discreetly testing psychological responses among the medical staff. Thekmor has contacts in the engineering corps, and Zaraketh has access to personnel files for the entire ship's complement. How long do we have to set this up? Marcus asked. For months, Zaraketh said. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. The genocide orders will be issued fleet-wide, and when they are, every human and Draconian in this conspiracy will need to be ready to act immediately. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. The survival of both species might depend on their ability to turn slavery into partnership, hatred into understanding, and fear into hope. It was an impossible task, but as he looked at the 3 Draconian faces around him, beings who had risked everything to oppose their own people's march toward genocide, Marcus realized that impossible was beginning to feel like their specialty. When do we start? He asked. We already have, Zaraketh replied, and for the first time since Marcus had met her, her golden eyes held something that looked like genuine hope. As they prepared to leave the maintenance chamber, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in the weeks since he had first witnessed a Draconian commander weeping alone in a hangar bay. That moment of unexpected vulnerability had started a chain reaction that might yet save 2 species from mutual destruction. It was fitting, somehow, that the solution to their conflict might lie not in strength or strategy, but in the simple human ability to see pain and respond with compassion, even when that pain belonged to a monster. Especially when that pain belonged to a monster who was trying to become something better. The message came during the evening shift change, transmitted through the ship's internal communication system with the cold efficiency that characterized all Draconian military orders. Marcus was in the middle of replacing a faulty power coupling when the announcement crackled through the hangar bay speakers, delivered in the mechanical tones of the ship's artificial intelligence. Attention, all personnel. High Command Directive 2847 Omega is now in effect. All military units are to report readiness status for Operation Final Cleansing. Human slave populations are to be secured in designated holding areas pending further instructions. This directive has immediate priority over all other operational requirements. Marcus felt his hands go numb around the tools he was holding. After 4 months of desperate preparation, the moment they had dreaded had finally arrived. Somewhere in the depths of imperial bureaucracy, the order for humanity's extinction had been signed and sealed. Within hours, atmospheric processors across the galaxy would begin their terrible work, stripping the breath from every world where humans had made their homes. Around him, the other human workers in the hangar bay had stopped their tasks, all of them frozen by the implications of what they had just heard. Some looked confused, not understanding the clinical language that had just announced their species' death sentence. Others understood perfectly, and their faces reflected the same numb shock that Marcus felt spreading through his own system. The Draconian overseers moved with swift efficiency, herding the human workers toward the exits with bark commands and the occasional electric prod. There was no malice in their actions, no sadistic pleasure. They were simply following orders with a mechanical precision that had made their military feared across the galaxy. Marcus allowed himself to be pushed along with the group, his mind racing as he tried to process their situation. According to the plan he and his conspirators had developed, this was the moment when sympathetic Draconians throughout the Empire would be forced to choose between following orders and protecting humans they had come to see as people. The success of their desperate gambit would depend on whether 4 months of careful preparation had been enough to spread their network of resistance across the Imperial military. As they were marched through the ship's corridors, Marcus caught sight of familiar faces among the Draconian personnel. There was Velterra, standing at a medical checkpoint with her usual professional composure intact. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Marcus saw something that might have been fear flickering behind her golden irises. Nearby, Thekmor was supervising the lockdown of engineering sections, his massive frame tense with barely controlled anxiety. The holding area turned out to be one of the ship's cargo bays, hastily converted with force field generators and basic life support systems. Marcus estimated that nearly 300 humans were being herded into the space. Every slave aboard the Crimson Talon gathered together like livestock awaiting slaughter. As the force fields activated, sealing them inside, Marcus began moving through the crowd of frightened humans, spreading the word they had prepared for this moment. The message was simple but crucial. When the time came, be ready to remind your Draconian contacts why genocide was wrong. Be ready to make the abstract personal, to transform military orders into moral choices. The response was mixed. Some of the slaves understood immediately, their faces lighting with desperate hope as they realized there might be a chance for survival. Others were too broken by years of captivity to believe that resistance was possible. A few questioned whether trusting Draconians, even sympathetic ones, was anything other than a path to betrayal and death. Marcus didn't blame the skeptics. After years of slavery, the idea that their captors might risk their own lives to save humanity required a leap of faith that bordered on the impossible. But as he moved through the crowd, Marcus found himself thinking about Zaraketh's tears in the Hangar Bay, about the genuine anguish in her voice when she spoke of the child on Kepler 442b. Some bridges couldn't be crossed through logic alone. They required trust, even when that trust seemed foolish. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The cargo bay had no viewports, leaving the humans trapped in a metal box with no knowledge of what was happening beyond the force fields. Occasionally, groups of Draconian personnel would approach the containment area, their conversations too quiet and distant to overhear. Marcus watched their body language for signs of conflict or hesitation, but their alien posture made it impossible to read their emotional state with any certainty. The first sign that their plan might be working came when Velterra appeared at the force field barrier, her medical kit conspicuously absent and her usual calm demeanor replaced by visible agitation. She approached the containment controls with hesitant movements, her claws hovering over the interface panel as if she couldn't decide whether to activate it. A human child, one of the few aboard the ship, the daughter of a specialist engineer, noticed Velterra's presence and approached the barrier. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, with the dark hair and curious eyes that seemed to characterize human young. She had been born into slavery, knowing no other life, but somehow her spirit remained unbroken. "Are you sad?" the child asked, pressing her small hand against the energy field that separated them. Velterra jerked back as if struck, her golden eyes fixing on the child with an expression of shock. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Velterra knelt down until she was at the child's eye level, placing her own massive clawed hand against the barrier in mirror of the child's gesture. "Yes, little one," Velterra whispered, her voice carrying clearly through the force field's energy matrix. "I'm very sad." "Why?" the child asked with a direct curiosity that only children possessed. Velterra's composure cracked like glass. "Because I'm supposed to let terrible things happen to you, and I don't think I can." The conversation drew the attention of other humans in the holding area, and soon a small crowd had gathered at the barrier. Other children joined the first, their innocent questions cutting through the clinical language of military orders to expose the moral reality of what was being asked. "Are you going to hurt us?" one boy asked. "Will we see our families again?" added another. Each question seemed to hit Velterra like a physical blow. Marcus watched as the draconian medical officer struggled with the weight of her orders, her professional training warring with the empathy that months of treating human patients had awakened in her. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Velterra finally said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." The moment stretched between species and generations, predator and prey, connected by something that transcended the artificial boundaries of empire and conquest. Then Velterra's hand moved to the containment controls, and the force field flickered and died. "Run," she whispered, her golden eyes wide with fear and determination. "Hide. Find the others who think like I do, and help them remember who they used to be before the Empire made us into monsters." Chaos erupted in the cargo bay as humans began streaming through the deactivated barrier. Some fled immediately, disappearing into the ship's maintenance tunnels and service areas. Others lingered, reaching out to touch Velterra's hands and speak words of gratitude that seemed to shock the Draconian as much as her own act of rebellion had. The child who had started the conversation was the last to leave. Before she ran, she looked up at Velterra with those dark, serious eyes and said, "Thank you for choosing to be good." Velterra's sob echoed through the cargo bay long after the humans had vanished into the ship's depths. Similar scenes were playing out across the Crimson Talon as other Draconian personnel found themselves confronted by the human cost of their orders. Thekmore abandoned his post in engineering when a human technician, a woman who had worked beside him for months, asked him to remember his clutch brother who had died rather than kill children. Security officers found their resolve wavering when human slaves they had come to know as individuals begged them to remember that genocide was wrong. But the most crucial confrontation was taking place in the ship's command center, where Zaraketh stood before the communications array that would relay the final genocide order to the atmosphere processors in her battle group. Marcus found her there after navigating the ship's service tunnels, following route maps that sympathetic Draconians had provided during their months of preparation. The command center was nearly empty, most of the bridge crew having been dismissed for security reasons while the sensitive operation proceeded. Zaraketh stood with her back to him, her massive frame silhouetted against the star field visible through the command center's main viewport. Her hand rested on the communication controls, but she had not yet activated them. "I wondered if you would come," she said without turning around. "I had to," Marcus replied, stepping out of the maintenance hatch. "This whole plan depends on you." "No," Zaraketh said quietly. "It depends on all of us choosing to be better than what we were made to be." She finally turned to face him, and Marcus saw that her golden eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do you know what happens to Draconian military officers who refuse direct orders from the High Command?" Marcus nodded. They had discussed the consequences during their planning sessions. Refusal to follow orders during military operations was considered the highest form of treason, punishable by public execution and the removal of the offender's name from all military records. It was not just death. It was erasure, the complete elimination of any trace that the person had ever existed. "I know," Marcus said, "but you also know what happens if you follow those orders. Humanity dies," Zaraketh acknowledged, "and with it, the only species we have encountered that could teach us to be something other than predators." She looked down at the communication console, her claws hovering over the controls that would doom billions of human lives. "My people will never forgive this betrayal, even if our plan succeeds. Even if we force the Empire to find alternatives to genocide, I will be remembered as a traitor who chose aliens over her own kind." "Maybe," Marcus said, "or maybe you'll be remembered as the Draconian who helped save two species from destroying each other." "History is written by the victors," Zaraketh replied, "and we don't know who will win this conflict." "Then, write your own history," Marcus suggested. Make a choice you can live with, regardless of how others judge it. Zaraketh's hand moved away from the communication controls, hovering instead over the emergency shutdown that would disable the entire command network. Will you stand with me? She asked. Marcus stepped forward until he stood beside her massive form, his small human hand coming to rest next to her clawed appendage on the console. Always. Together, they pressed the shutdown sequence. Alarms began wailing throughout the ship as the command network went dark, cutting the Crimson Talon off from the Imperial communication grid. In the engineering sections, Thekmor was systematically destroying the atmosphere processors, his technical expertise turned towards sabotage rather than conquest. Throughout the ship, humans and sympathetic Draconians worked together to disable weapons systems and communication arrays. But even as their rebellion spread through the ship, Marcus knew that their real test was yet to come. The Crimson Talon was just one vessel in a fleet of thousands. For their plan to succeed, similar acts of defiance would need to be taking place across the Empire, in every system where humans and Draconians had learned to see each other as something more than enemy and property. Through the command center's viewports, Marcus could see other ships in their battle group. Some were going dark like the Crimson Talon, their communication arrays falling silent, and their weapon systems powering down. Others maintained their military readiness, prepared to carry out the genocide order regardless of moral concerns. The Empire was fracturing along lines of conscience and duty exactly as they had hoped. But the final outcome remained uncertain, balanced on the knife's edge between salvation and mutual destruction. As emergency lighting bathed the command center in crimson illumination, Marcus realized that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Whatever happened next, the relationship between humans and Draconians had been fundamentally changed. They were no longer master and slave, conqueror and conquered. They were something new, something unprecedented in galactic history. They were allies, bound together by the revolutionary idea that different species could choose cooperation over domination, understanding over hatred. Whether that choice would be enough to save them remained to be seen. 6 months after the failed genocide order, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the newly renamed vessel Unity's Promise, watching as construction drones put the finishing touches on the galaxy's first integrated settlement. Below them, on the surface of the former mining world Kepler, 442b, humans and Draconians worked side by side to build something that had never existed before, a truly cooperative society. The settlement bore little resemblance to either species' traditional architecture. Human practicality had merged with Draconian engineering prowess to create structures that were both functional and beautiful, with soaring spires that accommodated Draconian wingspans alongside ground-level spaces designed for human comfort. Gardens developed by human agricultural specialists flourished under the careful tending of Draconian environmental engineers, producing crops that fed both species. It had been a long and difficult journey to reach this point. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion had been chaos. Nearly 40% of the Draconian military had ultimately refused to participate in the genocide, creating a schism that paralyzed the Empire's ability to function. Loyalist forces had attempted to carry out the extermination order using their remaining assets, but the sabotage efforts led by sympathetic Draconians had crippled too many atmosphere processors for the operation to succeed. The High Command's response had been swift and brutal. Summary executions were ordered for all personnel involved in the rebellion, with their names to be stricken from official records and their clutch lines declared extinct. But when the orders went out, the commanders discovered that they lacked the military strength to enforce them. Too many Draconians had been influenced by their contact with humans, and the Empire's iron discipline had finally encountered something stronger than fear. The civil war that followed had lasted 3 months and cost millions of lives on both sides. Loyalist forces fought with desperate ferocity, viewing the rebellion as an existential threat to everything they believed about Draconian superiority. Rebel forces fought with equal determination, driven by the revolutionary idea that strength could be measured by something other than the ability to dominate others. The turning point had come when rebel forces captured the imperial capital of Draco's Prime. Instead of executing the high command as tradition demanded, Zaraketh had made a proposal that shocked both sides of the conflict. The surviving leadership would be offered exile to a distant system, along with any Draconians who wished to maintain the old ways. In exchange, they would sign a formal treaty recognizing the sovereignty of the new human-Draconian alliance. It was an act of mercy that flew in the face of everything the Empire had taught about conflict resolution. Defeated enemies were supposed to be destroyed, not offered alternatives. The fact that humans had convinced their Draconian allies to show such restraint only reinforced the loyalists' conviction that human influence was indeed a threat to their species' fundamental nature. But it was also proof that the rebellion's goals had been achieved. The Draconian Empire was dead, replaced by something that neither species could have imagined when their conflict began. Marcus turned away from the viewport as the observation deck's doors whispered open behind him. Zaraketh entered, her massive frame moving with the careful grace she had developed during her time learning to navigate spaces designed for both species. She had grown thinner during the months of warfare, the stress of leadership leaving its mark on her reptilian features. But her golden eyes held a peace that Marcus had never seen during their early encounters aboard the Crimson Talon. "The medical teams have finished their survey of the construction crews," she reported, settling into a reinforced chair that accommodated her unique physiology. "No serious injuries, though Dr. Chun recommends that the Draconian workers limit their exposure to the planet's higher gravity levels." Marcus smiled at the casual way she mentioned his father's recommendation. Dr. David Chun had been among the first humans liberated during the rebellion's early phases, and his expertise in interspecies medicine had made him invaluable in establishing health protocols for integrated communities. The fact that his son had played a crucial role in the rebellion's success was a source of pride that the older man struggled to hide. "Any word from the other settlements?" Marcus asked. "Tau Ceti reports full operational status," Zaraketh replied. "They've successfully integrated their agricultural systems and are producing food surpluses for the first time since colonization began. The vegan system is still experiencing some cultural friction, but nothing that can't be resolved through mediation." Marcus nodded, reviewing the mental checklist of concerns that occupied most of his waking hours. As one of the Alliance's founding coordinators, he found himself responsible for ensuring that dozens of integrated settlements could function without falling back into the patterns of domination that had characterized their species' previous relationship. "What about the reports from the frontier territories?" he asked. Zaraketh's expression darkened slightly. 3 more incidents of loyalist raids on human refugee camps. No casualties this time, but they're becoming bolder. Intelligence suggests they may be planning a coordinated assault on one of our established settlements. The Loyalist remnants remained the Alliance's greatest challenge. Led by fanatics who viewed any cooperation with humans as species betrayal, they operated from hidden bases in the galaxy's outer rim, launching guerrilla attacks designed to prove that peaceful coexistence was impossible. Each raid claimed lives and threatened to undermine the fragile trust that the Alliance had worked so hard to build. "Do we have any leads on their base locations?" Marcus asked. "Several possibilities, but nothing confirmed. Feckmore believes he can trace their supply chains through the black market networks, but it will take time." Marcus leaned against the observation deck's railing, watching as a group of human children played in the settlement's central courtyard while their Draconian teacher supervised. The sight would have been impossible to imagine just 2 years ago, when the species had been locked in a relationship of absolute domination. Now it seemed natural, even inevitable. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting the wrong war," Marcus said quietly. Zaraketh's head tilted in the gesture he had learned to recognize as curiosity. "How so?" "The Loyalists see us as proof that their species has been corrupted by human influence," Marcus explained. "And maybe they're right. Maybe we did change you, made you into something different from what you were before. Is that troubling to you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "It should be, shouldn't it? We pride ourselves on accepting others as they are, but what we really did was convince an entire species to abandon fundamental aspects of their culture. You convinced us to abandon the parts of our culture that required us to inflict suffering on others, Zaraketh corrected. That is not the same thing as cultural destruction, isn't it? The Draconian Empire existed for thousands of years. It shaped every aspect of your civilization, from your art to your philosophy to your understanding of your place in the universe. We helped tear all of that down. Zaraketh was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes focused on something beyond the settlement below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of deep consideration. "Do you remember what I told you about the child on this world?" she asked. Marcus nodded. The memory of Zaraketh's breakdown in the hangar bay remained vivid, along with her description of the human child who had thanked her for a quick death. "I've thought about her every day since that encounter," Zaraketh continued. "Not just about her death, but about the civilization that produced her. Humans raised that child to believe that even her enemies deserved gratitude for small mercies. Your species taught her that compassion was more important than hatred, even in the face of extinction." She turned to look directly at Marcus, and he saw tears beginning to form in her golden eyes. "My species taught me that strength was measured by the ability to inflict suffering without remorse. We taught our young that empathy was weakness and that the suffering of others was irrelevant as long as it served imperial goals. We created a civilization that could murder children and call it duty." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued speaking. "If human influence destroyed that civilization, then I am grateful for the destruction. If your compassion corrupted our culture, then our culture deserved to be corrupted. Because what we have built together, this alliance, these settlements, this possibility of two species growing together instead of one destroying the other, this is worth more than 10,000 years of imperial glory." Marcus felt his own eyes beginning to water. In all their conversations over the past months, Zaraketh had never spoken so directly about the philosophical implications of what they had accomplished. "But don't you miss it?" Marcus asked. "The certainty, the sense of purpose that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were supposed to do." "I miss the simplicity," Zaraketh admitted. "There is comfort in believing that strength and righteousness were the same thing, that our empire's success proved the validity of our beliefs. But that comfort was built on a foundation of suffering that I can no longer ignore." She gestured toward the settlement below, where humans and Draconians continued their collaborative work. "This is more difficult. Every day brings new challenges, new conflicts to resolve, new ways that our species must learn to accommodate each other. There is no certainty here, no guarantee that what we are building will survive or succeed. But there's something that the Empire never offered: hope." "Hope for what?" "Hope that intelligence can evolve beyond the simple drive to dominate others. Hope that different species can find strength in cooperation rather than conquest. Hope that the future might be better than the past, not just for us, but for everyone we encounter." Marcus felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That sounds dangerously optimistic for a former military officer." "Perhaps," Zaraketh replied with what Marcus had learned to recognize as her version of a smile. "But I learned optimism from a species that thanked their executioners for small mercies. If humans can maintain hope in the face of extinction, then surely Draconians can learn to hope for something better than endless war." A soft chime echoed through the observation deck, indicating that their scheduled meeting with the Settlement Council was about to begin. Marcus and Zaraketh made their way toward the conference room, where representatives from both species would spend the next several hours working through the countless details required to maintain their unprecedented experiment in cooperation. As they walked, Marcus found himself thinking about the long chain of events that had brought them to this point. It had all started with a moment of unexpected vulnerability, a Draconian commander weeping alone in a hangar bay because she could no longer ignore the moral weight of her actions. That single moment of honesty had somehow grown into something large enough to topple an empire and create the foundation for an entirely new kind of civilization. Zaraketh, Marcus said as they reached the conference room doors. Yes. That night in the hangar bay, when I first found you crying, what would have happened if I had just walked away? Zaraketh paused, considering the question with the same careful attention she brought to all complex problems. I suppose I would have continued crying alone, she said finally. And eventually I would have stopped crying and returned to my duties. I would have followed the genocide order when it came, because I would have had no reason to believe that any alternative was possible. So everything we've built, the entire alliance, it all came from one human refusing to ignore someone else's pain? No, Zaraketh said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. It came from one human choosing to see a person where others saw only a monster. And from one draconian learning that being seen as a person carried responsibilities that she had never understood before. She touched the door controls, and the conference room opened to reveal a space filled with the voices of two species working together to solve problems that neither could address alone. Come, Zaraketh said, stepping into the room. We have a future to build. Marcus followed her inside, ready to continue the work of proving that compassion could indeed be stronger than conquest, that understanding could overcome hatred, and that two species could choose cooperation over domination. Outside the conference room windows, the twin sons of Kepler, 442b, continued their ancient dance across the sky, casting light on a world where humans and Draconians were writing a new chapter in the